From rags to riches, the journey of a black boy destined to cross paths with a paralyzed millionaire would forever alter both their lives. He offered healing in exchange for mere leftovers, while she responded with nothing but mockery, unaware that fate had orchestrated their meeting for reasons beyond imagination. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The iron gates of the Davis estate loomed over Michael Johnson like a fortress from another world. At 12 years old, he barely reached the intercom button, stretching his thin arm upward while his heart hammered against his ribs. The memory of his grandmother's words echoed in his mind. Your hands were meant to heal, not to beg. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn as Michael shifted his weight from one worn-out sneaker to the other. The air carried the sweet scent of jasmine from carefully tended gardens, mingling with distant barbecue smoke from somewhere beyond the high walls. This place existed in stark contrast to the cramped two-bedroom apartment he shared with Clara in Riverside Gardens, where the walls were thin and dreams often felt just as fragile. After 3 attempts, a security guard finally appeared, eyeing the boy suspiciously before reluctantly escorting him through grounds that seemed to stretch for miles. Michael's fingers nervously traced the small pouch of herbs in his pocket, a gift from his grandmother, a healer whose reputation in their neighborhood far outweighed her modest circumstances. Inside the mansion, Elizabeth Davis sat in her wheelchair near floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city skyline. The heiress's posture remained rigid despite her immobility, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her expression a practiced mask of boredom and disdain. Around her, 3 doctors in expensive suits spoke in hushed, clinical tones about prognoses and limitations, their voices carrying the weight of finality. "Ms. Davis," the security guard announced, "this boy insists on seeing you, says it's important." Elizabeth's gaze fell on Michael, taking in his faded jeans and determined expression with a single sweeping glance. "And what could possibly bring you to my door?" she asked, her voice carrying the polished edge of someone unaccustomed to being denied. Michael swallowed hard, his grandmother's teaching suddenly feeling impossibly naive in this temple of wealth and science. I can help you walk again," he stammered, the words tumbling out before courage could desert him. "No, all I want is the food you throw away." The silence that followed lasted only seconds before Elizabeth's laughter shattered it like glass, sharp and cutting. The doctors exchanged uncomfortable glances as the woman's shoulders shook with mirth that never reached her eyes. "Did you hear that, Dr. Miller?" Elizabeth gestured toward the most senior physician. "It seems I've been wasting my fortune on medical experts when I could have been cured by a child in exchange for table scraps." Michael stood his ground even as his cheeks burned with humiliation. In that moment, beneath the cruelty of her response, he caught something unexpected in the heiress's eyes, a flicker of desperation so profound it momentarily stripped away her practiced superiority. Elizabeth Davis's laughter ricocheted through the marble halls of the mansion, each echo like a slap across Michael Johnson's face. His cheeks burned with shame as he stood there, a 12-year-old boy from Riverside Gardens, suddenly feeling smaller than he'd ever felt before. "Leftovers for healing," Elizabeth wheezed between bursts of mocking laughter. "What's next, child? Magic beans? Fairy dust?" Her friends, wealthy women in designer clothes, tittered behind manicured hands, their eyes reflecting amusement at his expense. The household staff kept their gazes fixed on the floor. A maid with kind eyes briefly glanced at Michael with something like sympathy before quickly looking away. She'd probably been on the receiving end of Elizabeth's cruelty before. "I'm not lying, ma'am," Michael said quietly, his voice steadier than his hands. "My grandmother taught me. She's helped lots of people." "Your grandmother should teach you about reality instead," Elizabeth snapped, her wheelchair positioned like a throne. "Now run along before I call security." Michael turned to leave, his empty stomach protesting loudly enough that one of the women snickered. The sound made his spine straighten. He remembered Clara Johnson's words from just that morning as she'd prepared a healing poultice for their neighbor's arthritis. Never let pride make you cruel, Michael. It's the easiest sin and the hardest to wash away. He paused at the doorway, turning back to face the heiress. I'm sorry for bothering you, Miss Davis. If you change your mind, you know where to find me. For just a moment, so brief he almost missed it, something flickered across Elizabeth's face. Behind the mask of contempt, Michael caught a glimpse of something raw and wounded. Her eyes, cold blue and sharp as glass, held a sorrow so profound it seemed to swallow her from within. The physician standing beside her, Dr. Patricia Miller, noticed it too. Her professional smile faltered as she glanced between the boy and her patient with undisguised curiosity. Michael walked out of the Davis estate with empty hands and a growling stomach, but he carried away something far more valuable than food. He'd seen the truth that Elizabeth's wheelchair couldn't hide. Her paralysis went deeper than her legs. The gates of the mansion closed behind him with a metallic clang. As he began the long walk back to Riverside Gardens, Michael felt a strange certainty growing inside him. He would be back, not because he needed what Elizabeth could give him, but because, despite all her wealth, she needed what he could give her. The aroma of collard greens filled the modest kitchen as Clara Johnson stirred the pot with hands that bore the marks of decades of hard work. Steam rose in gentle clouds, fogging the small window that looked out onto their cramped backyard in Riverside Gardens. Michael sat at the wooden table, his school backpack still slung over one chair, recounting his encounter at the Davis estate. She laughed at me. Grandma, like I was nothing, Michael said, his voice small but steady. Elizabeth Davis just sat there in her wheelchair and laughed when I offered to help her. Clara nodded, her movements never faltering, as she added a pinch of something from a small jar, labeled only with symbols Michael was still learning to understand. Tell me exactly what you saw, child, not just what she said. Michael closed his eyes, remembering. Her laugh didn't match her eyes. And when I mentioned walking again, her fingers gripped the armrest so tight her knuckles went white. She clenched her fists like she was angry, but also scared. The elderly woman turned from the stove, her wise eyes studying her grandson. That's good noticing, Michael. That's the healer's eye coming through. She lowered herself into the chair across from him, her joints protesting with soft creaks. That child's not broken in her legs, Michael. She's broken in her spirit. Clara reached for Michael's hands, her touch gentle but firm. Our family has always seen what others miss. Your great-grandmother could tell a man's illness just by watching him walk through a doorway. She tapped his wrist. And watch for the signs the body can't hide. A twitch when certain words are spoken. A tremor in the voice. A tear that forms but never falls. Michael absorbed her words, feeling the weight of generations of knowledge pressing into him. But why would someone pretend they can't walk? Pain takes many forms, Clara replied, rising to check on their dinner. Sometimes the body finds ways to protect us from hurts too deep to face. The Davis girl might not even know she's hiding. Dr. Miller seemed convinced she's paralyzed, Michael said, remembering the physician's confident diagnosis mentioned during his visit. Clara's laugh was soft but knowing. Doctors see what they're trained to see. We see what's hidden. She placed a bowl of greens before him. Eat now. Tomorrow, I'll teach you more about reading bodies. If you're going to help that girl, you need to understand what's beneath her pride. Michael nodded, feeling both the burden and the blessing of his grandmother's wisdom settling on his shoulders. The hallways of Jefferson Middle School buzzed with whispers as Michael Johnson walked by. That's the kid who tried to scam Elizabeth Davis, someone muttered. The 12-year-old kept his eyes forward, pretending not to hear. Word traveled fast in their city, especially when it involved someone as influential as the Davis family. Principal Anderson called Michael into his office during lunch period. The man's desk was adorned with photos of him shaking hands with local celebrities, including Elizabeth at last year's fundraiser. Michael, he began, fingers steepled, I understand you visited the Davis estate recently. His tone was measured, careful. Ms. Davis has been incredibly generous to our school. The new computer lab, the gymnasium renovation, all her donations." The boy nodded, understanding the unspoken message. "I'd advise you to focus on your studies and stay away from the Davis family. Someone in your position shouldn't be making waves." Michael left the office with his dignity intact but his heart heavy. The principal hadn't needed to mention his position. Everyone knew the Johnsons lived in the poorest part of Riverside Gardens. Yet in classrooms, a different story unfolded. Ms. Reynolds beamed as she handed back his math test, another perfect score. Mr. Daniels asked him to read his essay aloud in English class, nodding approvingly at his analysis. His teachers recognized something in him that went beyond his address or the patches on his jeans. At home each evening, Clara Johnson would brew tea from plants she grew in mismatched pots on their tiny balcony. While they sipped, she'd share stories of healing that stretched back generations. "Look at this chamomile," she'd say, holding a dried flower between weathered fingers. "Most people see a simple plant, but I see something that can calm a racing heart or soothe a troubled mind." Michael absorbed everything. Which herbs reduced inflammation, which teas eased grief, which poultices drew out infection. But more importantly, he learned to recognize pain in all its disguises. "Some people wear their suffering like a crown," Clara told him one night, "and others hide it behind fancy cars and big houses. Your job isn't to judge which is more real. Your job is to see what others miss." He thought of Elizabeth Davis in her wheelchair, surrounded by wealth yet somehow empty. The way her laughter had sounded hollow, the flash of something vulnerable in her eyes before the mask of contempt returned. At school, Michael kept his head down and his grades up. While Elizabeth's influence might control the principal's office, it couldn't touch what was growing inside him: knowledge, compassion, and a determination that would eventually change everything. Elizabeth Davis pressed a button on her smartphone, summoning Dr. Patricia Miller for the third time that week. The physician arrived within the hour, her medical bag clutched tightly as she navigated the mansion's opulent hallways. "That boy came back," Elizabeth said, her voice tight with irritation. "The one from Riverside Gardens who claims he can heal me." Dr. Miller nodded, avoiding eye contact as she checked Elizabeth's vitals. The weight of their shared secret hung between them like a physical presence. For 7 years, Patricia had been treating Elizabeth's paralysis, a condition she'd never been fully convinced was physical. "Perhaps we should consider alternative therapies," Patricia suggested carefully, remembering the earnest face of Michael Johnson. She had watched from her car yesterday as Elizabeth had mocked the boy, sending him away empty-handed while household staff discarded perfectly good food. "Are you questioning my condition?" Elizabeth's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Of course not," Patricia replied quickly. Too quickly. The Davis family had paid for her medical school, had given her a position when no one else would after that misdiagnosis scandal. She owed them everything: her career, her reputation, her livelihood. Elizabeth dismissed her with a wave. "Just adjust my medication. The pain seems worse lately." After Patricia left, Elizabeth wheeled herself to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured gardens. The sunset painted the sky in hues that reminded her of the day everything changed, the day of the accident, the screeching tires, her father's angry voice moments before, the sensation of falling. She closed her eyes, remembering the hospital. The doctors had been puzzled by her symptoms, but her father's influence had silenced their questions. It was easier for everyone if Elizabeth stayed in the wheelchair, easier for her father's insurance claim, easier for Elizabeth to avoid his expectations. But now, alone in the growing darkness, Elizabeth glanced down at her legs, perfectly formed, unmarred, and utterly still. She tried to wiggle her toes, feeling the familiar resistance, like pushing against an invisible barrier. Michael's words echoed in her mind. "My grandmother says sometimes our bodies remember pain, our minds want to forget." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she reached down, touching her thigh. Had there been a slight twitch, a response she hadn't felt in years? "Ridiculous," she whispered to herself, but doubt had taken root. What if the boy was right? What if she had trapped herself in this chair? The thought terrified her more than any physical ailment could. For the first time since the accident, Elizabeth Davis questioned whether her prison had walls she herself had built, brick by brick, fear by fear, year after year. And if that were true, what would it mean to tear them down? The kitchen smelled of herbs and spices as Clara Johnson stirred a pot of medicinal tea. Michael watched his grandmother's weathered hands move with practiced precision, the same hands that had healed so many in riverside gardens over the decades. "There's something you need to know about the Davis family," Clara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Your great-grandmother, Eliza Johnson, was called to the Davis mansion during the influenza outbreak of '47. Elizabeth's grandmother, Margaret Davis, was burning with fever, abandoned by doctors who said she wouldn't last the night." Michael leaned forward, his schoolbooks forgotten on the table. What happened? For 3 days and nights, Eliza stayed by Margaret's bedside. She used the same remedies I've taught you, feverfew, elderberry, and prayers whispered into midnight air. Clara's eyes grew distant with memory. Margaret lived. The Davis family paid Eliza $20 and sent her away. 2 weeks later, they hosted a grand party celebrating Margaret's miraculous recovery. No mention of the black woman who saved her life. The boy's fingers curled into fists. Yet they erased her. That's what power does, child. Our knowledge has always been invisible to them until they need it. Clara placed a gnarled hand over his. But we keep healing anyway. Michael stared out the window toward the hill where the Davis mansion stood. Elizabeth needs our help now, whether she knows it or not. That evening, Michael filled a small notebook with observations from medical texts borrowed from the library. He noted subtle tests, a feather across the sole of the foot, temperature sensitivity, reflexes that couldn't be consciously controlled. If Elizabeth's paralysis was psychological rather than physical, these tests would reveal it. "What will you do if you're right?" Clara asked, watching him pack his backpack. "Help her walk again," he answered simply. "And if she refuses your help?" Michael paused, remembering Elizabeth's cold laughter. The way her eyes had flickered with something deeper than contempt. "Then I'll keep coming back until she doesn't." The next morning, Michael stood once more before the iron gates of the Davis estate. This time, his heart beat steady and strong. He carried not just his grandmother's wisdom, but the weight of his family's invisible history. The security guard recognized him, hesitated, then reluctantly opened the gate. As he walked up the winding driveway, Michael felt a strange certainty. The mansion no longer intimidated him. Elizabeth Davis was not just a wealthy woman in a wheelchair, she was someone trapped by her own mind, just as her grandmother had once been trapped by fever. And just like his great-grandmother before him, Michael Johnson had come to heal. The Davis mansion gleamed under the evening stars, its windows ablaze with chandeliers casting golden light across manicured lawns. Inside, the annual charity gala for children's education, ironically enough, was in full swing. Michael Johnson had never seen such opulence up close. He adjusted the borrowed server's jacket that hung loosely on his 12-year-old frame and slipped through the service entrance, heart hammering against his ribs. Wealthy patrons in designer attire mingled over champagne flutes, their laughter tinkling like the crystal they held. Michael kept his head down, balancing a tray of hors d'oeuvres as he'd practiced at home with his grandmother. Clara had warned him about the risk, but understood his determination. Across the grand ballroom, Elizabeth Davis held court from her wheelchair. She wore an emerald gown that cascaded around her like liquid jewels, her hair swept into an elegant updo that accentuated her sharp features. The heiress smiled graciously at donors, looking every bit the benevolent philanthropist while signing checks with flourishing strokes. Dr. Patricia Miller stood nearby, engaged in conversation with board members but keeping a watchful eye on her patient. The physician's professional demeanor masked her growing unease about Elizabeth's condition, doubts she'd buried beneath years of loyalty to the Davis family. Michael circulated carefully, working his way toward the center of the room. When Elizabeth's gaze finally landed on him, recognition flashed across her face. Her smile froze, then twisted into something harder. With a subtle gesture, she summoned security. "That boy doesn't belong here," she hissed to a guard. But Michael had already reached Dr. Patricia. With deliberate calm, he dropped his napkin near Elizabeth's feet. As he bent to retrieve it, he gently pressed a specific point on her ankle, a test his grandmother had taught him. Elizabeth's foot jerked reflexively. Dr. Patricia gasped, her champagne glass nearly slipping from her fingers. The doctor's face drained of color as she stared at the movement. Unmistakable, undeniable. "That's impossible," she whispered. Conversations around them faltered. A hush spread through the nearest guests, their curious gazes drawn to the tableau. The boy in ill-fitting formal wear, the pale-faced doctor, and Elizabeth, whose composure cracked like fine porcelain. For one unguarded moment, raw fear replaced her practiced poise. The security guard gripped Michael's shoulder, but the boy stood tall. "Your legs work, Miss Davis," he said quietly. "They always have." In that electric moment, the power shifted. The mansion's grandeur seemed to dim around them as truth illuminated something far more significant. Michael caught a glimpse of vulnerability in Elizabeth's eyes, and with it, his first real hope. The silence that followed Michael Johnson's demonstration was deafening. Elizabeth Davis's face contorted with rage, her manicured nails digging into the armrests of her wheelchair as security personnel hovered uncertainly nearby. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "This boy is nothing but a charlatan trying to humiliate me in my own home." The elegant charity gala guests shifted uncomfortably, their champagne flutes frozen mid-air. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I'll make sure your precious scholarship disappears by morning. Do you understand what happens when you cross someone like me?" Michael stood his ground, shoulders squared despite the tremor in his hands. The lessons from his grandmother Clara echoed in his mind. Healing required courage. "You're not weak, Mr. Davis," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "You're terrified." The heiress recoiled as if slapped. For a fleeting moment, vulnerability flashed across her face before hardening into stone. She signaled to security, who escorted Michael from the mansion with firm but hesitant hands. Dr. Patricia Miller watched the scene unfold, her professional demeanor cracking under the weight of long-suppressed guilt. The physician had served the Davis family for years, her career built on their patronage and influence. Yet the truth had become a physical burden she could no longer carry. Hours later, Patricia's car pulled alongside Michael as he walked home through the darkened streets of Riverside Gardens. "Get in," she said, her voice barely audible. "We need to talk." At a deserted diner, the doctor's hands trembled around her coffee cup. "Elizabeth's medical scans have always been inconclusive," she confessed, unable to meet the 12-year-old's eyes. "There's no physical damage that explains her paralysis." Michael leaned forward. "Then why?" "The medications I've prescribed are primarily for anxiety, not paralysis," Patricia continued, shame coloring her words. "After the accident, she simply couldn't walk anymore. Or wouldn't. The line blurred years ago." The boy nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "My grandmother says sometimes the body locks what the mind can't face." Patricia looked up, surprised by his insight. Elizabeth's father covered everything up. The family couldn't bear the scandal of a psychological condition. It was easier to claim physical injury, collect the insurance, and maintain the illusion. "She needs real healing," Michael said quietly. The doctor's professional facade crumbled completely. "I know, and it terrifies her more than any physical pain ever could." Word of Michael Johnson's confrontation with Elizabeth Davis spread through Riverside Gardens like wildfire. The 12-year-old who dared to challenge the wealthiest woman in the city had become something of a local legend overnight. That boy's either got courage or foolishness running through his veins. Mrs. Patterson remarked at the corner store, shaking her head while bagging Michael's groceries. In their modest kitchen, Clara watched her grandson with worried eyes. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she prepared a healing tea, the aroma of herbs filling their small home. "They're talking about you all over the neighborhood," she said, sliding a chipped mug across the table. "Some think you've lost your mind going up against the Davis family." Michael stared into the steaming liquid. "I just told her the truth, Grandma." Clara nodded, her eyes reflecting wisdom accumulated over decades. "Truth is a powerful medicine, child, but powerful medicines can be dangerous." She reached across to squeeze his hand. "The real healing demands sacrifice, from both the healer and the one being healed. Are you prepared for what that might cost you?" The boy didn't answer immediately, understanding the weight of her words. The scholarship that kept him in school hung in the balance, along with their already precarious financial situation. Across town, Elizabeth sat alone in her vast bedroom, the mansion eerily quiet around her. She'd dismissed the staff for the evening, needing solitude. Sleep had become her enemy, filled with vivid nightmares of the accident, the screeching tires, the impact, her father's voice afterward telling her what to say, what to feel. "You're a Davis," he had insisted from her hospital bed. "And Davis women don't show weakness." Elizabeth reached for her medication, then hesitated. Dr. Miller's concerned face flashed in her mind, followed by the determined expression of that Johnson boy. His eyes had held something she rarely encountered. Not pity, not greed, but something else entirely. Why wouldn't he just leave her alone? What could possibly drive a child from Riverside Gardens to risk everything just to help her? The thought nagged at her, more irritating than the phantom sensations in her legs that the doctors insisted weren't real. She wheeled herself to the window, gazing toward the direction of the neighborhood where Michael lived. For the first time in years, Elizabeth felt something crack within her carefully constructed walls, a dangerous curiosity about whether the boy might be right. "What if?" she whispered to the empty room, the question hanging incomplete in the air as a single tear slid down her cheek. Michael Johnson sat at the kitchen table, his hand trembling slightly as he sealed the envelope. Inside was a 4-page letter to the school board, meticulously documenting Elizabeth Davis's attempts to revoke his scholarship. Clara watched from across the room, her weathered hands folded in silent prayer. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have to, Grandma," he replied. "If I don't stand up now, she'll just keep hurting people." The next morning, Principal Anderson received the letter. His office felt unusually small as he read through Michael's allegations, each one more troubling than the last. The school depended heavily on Davis family donations, but these claims couldn't be ignored. With reluctance weighing on his shoulders, he scheduled a meeting for Friday afternoon. Meanwhile, across town, reporter Vanessa Torres scrolled through archived newspaper clippings. What had begun as a human interest story about a wealthy philanthropist had led her down a rabbit hole of suspicious insurance claims following Elizabeth's accident. Medical records showed inconsistencies, and former Davis household staff hinted at elaborate deceptions. "This goes deeper than I thought," Vanessa murmured to herself, jotting notes in her worn leather notebook. Friday arrived with storm clouds gathering. Michael entered the school administration building, his school uniform pressed and spotless. Inside the conference room, Principal Anderson sat flanked by 2 board members. Elizabeth had sent her attorney instead of appearing personally, a calculated move that didn't surprise the young healer. "Mr. Johnson," the principal began, "these are serious accusations against one of our most generous benefactors." Michael met his gaze steadily. "I have evidence, sir, and witnesses." As they spoke, Elizabeth's smartphone buzzed incessantly at her mansion. Former friends were suddenly unavailable for lunch. Invitations to charity galas mysteriously disappeared. The whispers had begun. Dr. Patricia Miller watched this unfolding drama with growing unease. She'd spent years helping maintain Elizabeth's facade, but seeing Michael's courage made her question everything. That evening, She found herself parked outside Vanessa Torres's apartment building, a manila folder of medical records on the passenger seat. Back in Riverside Gardens, Michael returned home exhausted but resolute. The meeting had ended without resolution, but he'd planted seeds of doubt. "They're listening now," he told Clara as she placed a bowl of soup before him, "and she knows it." Across town, Elizabeth sat alone in her vast dining room, untouched food growing cold before her. For the first time in years, she felt truly afraid. Her carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble, and a 12-year-old boy from the wrong side of town was somehow holding the sledgehammer. Clara Johnson's cough echoed through their small apartment as Michael placed a damp cloth on her forehead. Her weathered hands trembled slightly, but her eyes remained sharp and knowing. Every morning before school, Michael gathered wildflowers from the vacant lot 2 blocks over, arranging them in a chipped mug by her bedside. "Mrs. Ramirez sent this sourdough," Michael said, unwrapping the warm bread their neighbor had pressed into his hands. "She says it'll put strength back in your bones." Clara smiled weakly. "That woman's bread has more healing power than half my remedies." She patted the edge of her bed, inviting him to sit. "Now tell me what's troubling you, child." Michael Johnson was torn. Elizabeth's attempts to discredit him at school continued, yet his grandmother needed him more than ever. As if reading his thoughts, Clara shared stories of ancestors who'd faced impossible choices, healers who'd walked miles through storms to reach the sick, while their own families waited. "Justice and care are twins," she whispered. "You can't truly have one without the other." Across town, Elizabeth Davis surveyed the grand ballroom of her estate. Crystal chandeliers reflected off polished marble as caterers arranged elaborate displays. This gala would restore her reputation and silence the whispers. The new Davis Foundation for Neurological Research would cement her status as a victim-turned-philanthropist. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Miss Davis?" asked an assistant, nervously adjusting flower arrangements. Elizabeth nodded curtly, wheeling herself toward the stage. Her speech sat ready on the podium, a masterpiece of calculated sympathy and strategic generosity. What she didn't anticipate was Michael arriving with Dr. Patricia Miller. The physician looked pale but determined as they slipped in through a side entrance. In her hands, Patricia clutched a folder containing test results and psychological evaluations, evidence that Elizabeth's paralysis had no physical cause. When Elizabeth reached the climax of her speech, describing her incurable condition, Michael stood. The crowd parted as he walked forward, his school uniform pressed but worn at the edges. "Miss Davis knows she can walk," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Dr. Miller has confirmed it." Patricia stepped forward, professional composure barely masking her anxiety. "The tests show no physical damage to the spine or nervous system," she announced. "Elizabeth's condition is psychosomatic, triggered by trauma, maintained by fear." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Elizabeth's knuckles whitened against her wheelchair's armrests as her carefully constructed world began to crumble before her eyes. A collective gasp rippled through the elegant ballroom as Dr. Patricia Miller's voice carried the weight of her confession. Her hands trembled against the podium, knuckles white with tension. "As Elizabeth's physician for the past 3 years, I can confirm that her condition is primarily psychological, not physical. The scans have always been inconclusive." The crowd erupted into murmurs and shocked exclamations. Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing the moment when Elizabeth Davis's carefully constructed world began to crumble. Her face, usually a mask of composed elegance, contorted with a mixture of rage and terror. "This is preposterous," Elizabeth shouted, but her voice cracked, betraying her. Her manicured fingers gripped the armrests of her wheelchair so tightly that her knuckles blanched. For a moment, something remarkable happened. She pushed herself upward, attempting to stand as if to physically fight the accusations. Michael Johnson moved swiftly to her side, his 12-year-old frame somehow steady against her faltering one. As her knees buckled beneath the weight of years of deception, he caught her elbow. "You can do this," he whispered, his voice carrying a wisdom far beyond his years. "Just breathe." The heiress's eyes met his, wild with panic. The boy from Riverside Gardens, whom she had laughed at and dismissed, was now her only support in a room full of former admirers turned vultures. The crowd pressed closer, their faces a blur of judgment and morbid fascination. Someone shouted a question about insurance fraud. Another demanded to know how long the charade had continued. The charity gala, meant to cement Elizabeth's reputation as a benevolent philanthropist, had transformed into her public trial. "Get away from me," she hissed at Michael, but her grip on his arm tightened contradictorily. Tears streamed down her face, smearing expensive makeup. The woman who had controlled every aspect of her environment for years now found herself utterly exposed. The crack in her armor wasn't just visible, it was splitting her wide open. With a sudden surge of desperate energy, Elizabeth pushed Michael away and wheeled herself rapidly toward the exit. The crowd parted reluctantly, smartphones raised to capture her retreat. The flashes followed her like predators, documenting every second of her humiliation. As she disappeared through the grand doors, the whispers grew louder, old friends huddled in corners, already distancing themselves from her downfall. Dr. Patricia stood alone at the podium, her professional life hanging in the balance of her truth-telling. Michael remained in the center of the storm, watching the door through which Elizabeth had fled. Clara had taught him that true healing often began with the most painful breaking open. Tonight, Elizabeth Davis had finally begun to crack. The morning newspapers arrived at the Davis mansion like vultures, headlines screaming, "Heiress lied about paralysis," in bold black letters. Elizabeth Davis sat in her bedroom, curtains drawn against the world, the newspapers scattered across her bed like fallen leaves. She had unplugged her phone after the 20th call from former friends seeking comments or, worse, offering false sympathy. "Miss Davis has no statement at this time," her head of security repeated to the reporters camped outside the gates. Even her family's lawyers, men who had defended the Davis name for generations, sent terse emails suggesting they reassess their professional relationship given recent developments. Elizabeth hadn't showered in 3 days. Her hair hung limp around her hollow face as she stared at the wheelchair pushed into the corner of her room. The chair that had been both prison and protection now stood as evidence of her deception. On the 4th day of her isolation, a soft knock came at her bedroom door. "Miss Davis, it's Michael. I brought you something." She didn't answer. The 12-year-old boy from Riverside Gardens was the last person she wanted to see. Yet he returned the next day, and the next, his voice never rising in frustration when she refused to respond. "My grandmother says cornbread heals more than hunger," he said through the door on the 7th day, the scent of warm bread seeping under the doorframe, "and the tea helps with sleep." That night, after he left, Elizabeth cracked open her door. The small basket sat waiting, cornbread wrapped in a checkered cloth, a thermos of tea, and a handwritten note. "Healing starts with forgiveness. First yourself, then others." Michael Johnson returned daily, sometimes sitting silently outside her door for hours, sometimes telling stories about school or his grandmother Clara's wisdom. Elizabeth found herself listening for his footsteps, the anger in her heart slowly giving way to exhaustion. Then curiosity. "Why do you keep coming back?" she finally called through the door on the 12th day. "I humiliated you. I tried to ruin your future. Because my grandmother taught me that the people who need kindness most are the ones who show it least," he answered simply. Dr. Patricia Miller called twice, leaving voicemails filled with apologies and offers to help with therapy. Elizabeth deleted them all. The only voice that didn't grate on her nerves was Michael's, steady, without pity or judgment. By the 2nd week, Elizabeth had moved her chair closer to the door during his visits. She still didn't open it, but sometimes she would press her palm against the wood, wondering if he could somehow sense her there, listening, beginning to heal. The evening air hung heavy with the scent of rain when Elizabeth Davis finally opened her door. Michael Johnson had been sitting outside for nearly 3 hours, his homework spread across his lap. She stood in the doorway, a shadow of her former self, gaunt, with dark circles beneath eyes rimmed red from crying. "You're stubborn," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael smiled, gathering his books. "So are you." The 12-year-old entered the room cautiously. Elizabeth's once immaculate bedroom had transformed into a fortress of isolation. Curtains drawn tight against the world, half-empty water glasses littering the nightstand, and the wheelchair pushed into a corner as if in time out. "My grandmother says stubbornness can be a virtue when it's for the right reasons," Michael said, setting down his backpack. Elizabeth lowered herself to the edge of her bed, hands trembling slightly. "And what makes you think this is the right reason?" "Because everyone deserves to heal," he answered simply. Their first session began tentatively. Michael guided her through breathing exercises Clara had taught him. Passed down through generations of Johnson healers, Elizabeth's skepticism was palpable, but desperation had finally overcome pride. "I need you to picture your legs waking up," Michael instructed, "like they're just remembering how to move." Elizabeth closed her eyes, her fingers gripping the bedsheets so tightly her knuckles whitened. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, but didn't stop. "My grandmother healed people the doctors couldn't help," Michael continued, his voice steady and reassuring. "She says sometimes our bodies remember pain so well they forget how to let it go." Each day, Michael returned after school. Dr. Patricia Miller occasionally observed from the doorway, her professional curiosity battling with guilt over years of misdiagnosis. The physician watched as Michael used visualization techniques that seemed primitive compared to her medical training, yet produced results her prescriptions never had. By the end of the week, Elizabeth managed to wiggle her toes, a tiny movement that brought tears to her eyes. "I felt it," she whispered, looking up at Michael with wonder. "I actually felt it." Michael nodded, remembering Clara's words. "Healing isn't just about the body. It's about believing you deserve to be whole again." Progress was painfully slow. Some days Elizabeth refused to try, retreating into bitterness. Other days, determination pushed her further than either expected. Her hands would tremble as she gripped the edge of the bed, attempting to stand while Michael stood ready to catch her. The heiress who once laughed at a poor boy's offer now hung on his every word, finding strength in ancient wisdom that money could never buy. The winter sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Davis mansion as Elizabeth's toes curled ever so slightly. Michael Johnson leaned forward, his eyes wide with excitement. "You did it again," he exclaimed, his voice cracking with joy. Elizabeth Davis stared at her feet in disbelief. For the first time in years, she could feel the cool marble beneath her soles. The sensation was both foreign and familiar, like remembering a long-forgotten dream. "It's strange," she whispered, a tentative smile playing at her lips. "Like waking up parts of myself I buried." Each day brought new progress. Sometimes it was just a twitch of her ankle, or the ability to hold her legs steady for 5 seconds longer than before. Michael documented every victory in a worn notebook, the same one where his grandmother recorded her healing wisdom. Clara had taught him that celebration was part of healing, so they marked each milestone. On the day Elizabeth stood for 3 full minutes, Michael arrived with a basket of warm biscuits, the recipe passed down through generations of Johnsons. "My grandmother says food made with intention carries medicine," he explained, breaking open a steaming biscuit. The rich, buttery aroma filled the sunroom they now used for their daily sessions. Elizabeth laughed, not the cold, cutting laugh from their first meeting, but something genuine that reached her eyes. "My nutritionist would have a fit." "Some things are worth breaking rules for," Michael replied, passing her the honey. As they ate, he shared stories of riverside gardens, of neighbors who shared childcare duties, of community gardens planted in abandoned lots, of music that drifted through open windows on summer evenings. "We don't have much," he admitted, But nobody faces trouble alone. The heiress listened, fascinated by a world so different from her isolated existence. In return, she began to share pieces of herself, fragments at first, then whole chapters. But my father measured success in numbers, she confided one afternoon as she practiced standing. Bank accounts, test scores, calories. Her hands trembled slightly. Nothing was ever enough. Michael listened without judgment as she described the crushing weight of expectations, the constant fear of disappointment. Then finally, she spoke of the accident, not the public version reported in newspapers, but the truth. "I wasn't driving recklessly," she whispered. "I was running away. From him. From everything." Her voice broke. "When I woke up in the hospital, being unable to walk felt safer somehow." Dr. Patricia had suspected as much, but hearing Elizabeth admit it aloud marked a breakthrough more significant than any physical progress. The 12-year-old boy from Riverside Gardens had accomplished what teams of specialists couldn't. He had created a space where healing could begin. "Can't tomorrow," Elizabeth said with newfound determination. "I want to try walking to the door." Dr. Patricia Miller sat in the Stark government office, her hands trembling as she recounted years of falsified medical reports. The weight of her complicity had become unbearable after witnessing Michael's unwavering compassion. "I knew Elizabeth Davis wasn't physically paralyzed," she confessed to the federal investigators. "I helped maintain the illusion because her family's donations funded my research." Within 48 hours, federal agents descended upon the Davis estate. Elizabeth watched from her bedroom window as men and women in dark suits carried boxes of financial records to their vehicles. The investigation revealed a web of tax evasion, insurance fraud, and misappropriated charity funds, all orchestrated by Elizabeth's late father and perpetuated through her foundations. "All accounts frozen pending investigation," read the official notice. Elizabeth stared at the paper, her world collapsing around her. The heiress who once commanded respect with a glance now faced public humiliation and possible criminal charges. Her phone stopped ringing. Former friends disappeared overnight. Even her attorney suggested she consider a plea deal. Michael Johnson arrived that evening, finding Elizabeth alone in the vast dining room. The mansion staff had been let go that morning. No severance, no warning. The 12-year-old boy from Riverside Gardens stood quietly in the doorway, watching as she attempted to open a can of soup with trembling hands. "Need help?" he asked softly. Elizabeth looked up, her pride warring with desperation. "Come to gloat!" Her voice cracked, betraying her exhaustion. "No, Mum. My grandmother says nobody deserves to eat alone." Michael stepped forward, gently taking the can opener from her hands. The simple act of kindness broke something inside her. "I've lost everything," Elizabeth whispered, tears finally breaking through her carefully constructed facade. "The money, the reputation, the foundations, all gone." Michael worked silently, heating the soup and finding crackers in a cupboard. "You haven't lost everything," he finally said, placing the simple meal before her. "You still have your legs. They work, they've always worked, and you have a choice now." "What choice?" she asked bitterly. "Prison or poverty?" "Healing," Michael answered simply. "Real healing, not just your legs, but everything else too." Outside, reporters gathered at the gates, their cameras flashing in the growing darkness. The Davis mansion, once a monument to wealth and privilege, now stood as a symbol of fallen grace. Inside, Elizabeth faced the most difficult decision of her life: cling to the remnants of her pride or accept the healing offered by a boy who had every reason to abandon her. She looked at Michael's outstretched hand and took a deep breath. Elizabeth Davis stood at the entrance of her mansion, leaning on a cane rather than sitting in her wheelchair. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn as she watched Michael Johnson and Clara approach. Her hands trembled slightly, not from physical weakness, but from the enormity of what she was about to do. "I want you both to stay here," she said, her voice lacking its former imperial tone. "This place is too big for one person, especially one who's learning to walk again. Clara's weathered face creased with surprise. "Child, are you certain?" Elizabeth nodded, leading them through halls that seemed emptier now. Auction notices lay on antique tables, and spaces gaped where paintings once hung. The mansion was being stripped of its excesses, each sale helping to pay back what investigations had revealed were questionable insurance claims. "The East Wing has 2 bedrooms with a shared bathroom," Elizabeth explained. "I thought you might be comfortable there." Michael ran his hand along a marble countertop, remembering his first visit when he'd been too afraid to touch anything. "What about all your things?" "Just things," she replied. "I'm learning what matters." Within days, the transformation began. The grand dining room, where Elizabeth had once hosted politicians and celebrities, became a community kitchen. Tables that had held crystal and china now supported industrial cooking pots and donated vegetables. Clara moved through the space with quiet authority, teaching neighborhood women recipes that stretched ingredients and nourished bodies. Her knowledge, once dismissed by the wealthy, was now sought after. Elizabeth watched, learning alongside everyone else. "You've given my grandson a gift," Clara told her one evening as they chopped onions side by side. "He's becoming who he was meant to be." Indeed, Michael's reputation had spread beyond Riverside Gardens. People came seeking his counsel, not just for physical ailments, but for guidance. At 13, his wisdom seemed ancient, his compassion limitless. "You're my miracle worker," Elizabeth told him one afternoon during their daily walking practice in the garden. Michael shook his head. "There's no miracle, just wisdom from my grandmother, courage from you, and a little faith from both of us." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The boy who had knocked on her door asking for leftovers now helped her distribute food to those in need. The mansion that had symbolized exclusion became a place of welcome. One night, as rain pattered against the windows, Elizabeth found Michael studying in what had been her father's library. "I never thought I'd be grateful for losing everything," she admitted. "You haven't lost everything," Michael replied. "You've just found what was always there." Word of the Johnson method spread through the city like wildfire. What began as whispers in Riverside Gardens soon reached the affluent neighborhoods, drawing curious onlookers and desperate families seeking miracles of their own. Reporters from local newspapers and television stations lined up outside the former Davis mansion, cameras ready to capture the impossible. Elizabeth Davis walking again. On a crisp autumn morning, Elizabeth took her first public steps. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the specially designed walker Michael Johnson had fashioned from materials donated by neighborhood craftsmen. The heiress moved with deliberate concentration, her face a portrait of determination rather than the haughty pride that once defined her. "Small steps, Miss Davis," Michael encouraged softly, walking beside her. At 12 years old, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone much older. "Remember what we practiced." Clara Johnson watched from the sidelines, her weathered hands clasped together, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Her grandson had taken the healing knowledge she'd passed down, remedies and techniques dismissed by modern medicine, and transformed it into something the world couldn't ignore. "My grandmother always said healing isn't just about the body," Michael explained to a reporter who thrust a microphone toward him. "It's about believing you can get better." The former mansion, now bearing a hand-painted sign reading Clara Johnson Community Center, had undergone a transformation as remarkable as its owners. Where crystal chandeliers once hung, simple but warm lighting illuminated spaces where neighborhood children gathered for tutoring. The formal dining room served hot meals to families struggling to make ends meet. Outside, the manicured gardens that once showcased exotic flowers solely for display had been replanted with medicinal herbs, vegetables, and fruit trees. Volunteers from Riverside Gardens tended these plots, many learning the healing properties of plants from Clara herself. "I never thought I'd see the day whispered Dr. Patricia Miller to Clara as they watched Elizabeth complete her circuit around the former ballroom. The physician had risked her career by coming forward with the truth, but the weight of guilt had lifted from her shoulders. Children from the neighborhood pressed their faces against windows, pointing excitedly whenever Elizabeth managed another step. To them, the mansion was no longer a forbidden fortress, but a place of possibility. "This isn't about me anymore," Elizabeth told a cluster of reporters, her voice steady despite her physical exertion. "This is about what happens when we stop throwing away people and their wisdom." She reached for Michael's hand, squeezing it in gratitude as cameras flashed around them. The garden beyond the windows bloomed with more than plants. It overflowed with something the Davis estate had never known before: hope. The newly renamed Clara Johnson Community Center buzzed with activity as residents from Riverside Gardens and beyond gathered for its official opening. Elizabeth Davis stood at the podium, her posture straight but still bearing the slight tremor of someone relearning to trust her own body. She gripped the edges of the wooden stand, taking a deep breath before addressing the crowd. "A year ago, I would have paid thousands to avoid standing here before you," Elizabeth said, her voice clear despite her nervousness. "But today, I stand here because of two people who saw value in me when I couldn't see it in myself." The heiress gestured toward Michael Johnson and Clara, seated in the front row. The elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while her grandson beamed with quiet pride. Michael knocked on my door, offering healing in exchange for food I was throwing away," she continued. "I laughed at him. I used my influence to try to destroy his future." Elizabeth paused, composing herself. "What I didn't understand then was that he wasn't just offering to heal my legs, he was offering to heal my soul." The crowd listened in respectful silence as she detailed her journey from deception to truth, from isolation to community. She promised to use what remained of the Davis fortune to establish scholarships and community programs that would serve Riverside Gardens for generations. "My wealth bought me nothing but loneliness," she admitted, "but Michael and Clara's wisdom gave me everything." After the ceremony, Michael found himself surrounded by well-wishers. At 14, he stood taller now, his shoulders carrying both the confidence of his accomplishments and the responsibility of his growing reputation. Principal Anderson approached with an envelope in hand. "Full scholarship to Westridge University," the administrator announced. "They're very impressed with your healing work. This could be your ticket out of Riverside Gardens." Michael accepted the envelope but shook his head. "Thank you, but I'm not looking for a ticket out. My grandmother's knowledge belongs here, where it's needed most." Later that evening, Dr. Patricia Miller joined them for a modest celebration dinner. The physician had faced professional consequences for her role in Elizabeth's deception, but now worked part-time at the community clinic they'd established in the East Wing of the former mansion. "You could go anywhere, do anything," Patricia told Michael as they shared homemade cornbread. "Why stay?" Michael glanced around at the dining room where he'd once been humiliated, now filled with laughter and community. "Because true healing isn't about escaping," he replied. "It's about transforming what's broken into something beautiful." 1 year had passed since that fateful day when Michael Johnson first stood trembling at the gates of the Davis estate. Now, on a warm Saturday afternoon, he leaned against the community center's doorframe, watching with quiet pride as the former mansion buzzed with activity. Children from Riverside Gardens raced through hallways once reserved for the elite, their laughter echoing off walls that had witnessed both cruelty and redemption. Elizabeth Davis moved through the crowd with practiced ease, balancing a tray of freshly baked cookies. Her steps were still cautious, sometimes uneven, but they were hers. The wheelchair that had once defined her existence now sat forgotten in a storage closet, gathering dust alongside other remnants of her former life. She caught Michael's eye across the room and smiled, a genuine expression that had replaced her once icy stare. "These disappear faster than I can serve them," Elizabeth said, approaching the 12-year-old who had changed everything. Clara Johnson worked alongside volunteers at the serving table, her weathered hands guiding younger helpers with the patience of generations. The elderly healer's wisdom now flowed freely through the community center named in her honor, touching lives far beyond what she had ever imagined possible. "Your grandmother said the garden will be ready for harvest next week," Elizabeth continued, setting down her empty tray. "I never thought I'd be excited about vegetables." Michael nodded, remembering how he had once begged for mere leftovers from this woman's table. Now they worked side by side, feeding neighbors who had previously been invisible to the Davis family. Dr. Patricia Miller arrived with medical supplies for the free clinic they had established in what was once Elizabeth's private study. The physician had faced professional consequences for her role in the cover-up, but found unexpected purpose in serving those who truly needed her skills. The university called again," Patricia mentioned to Michael as she passed. "They're still hoping you'll reconsider their early admission offer." The boy smiled but shook his head. There would be time for that later. For now, his place was here, where healing happened not through textbooks, but through connection. As evening approached, residents gathered in the main hall for a community meal. Elizabeth stood, unassisted, to address the room, her voice carrying confidence that came not from wealth, but from hard-won self-knowledge. "A year ago, I thought I had lost everything," she said. "I didn't realize I had never truly had anything that mattered." Michael watched from beside his grandmother, their hands clasped together. The journey had transformed them all, a boy who found his purpose, a healer who secured her legacy, and a broken woman who learned to stand again, both literally and figuratively. In the end, Riverside Gardens had been healed not by money or medicine, but by courage, wisdom, and the simple power of believing in something greater than oneself.